Hey everyone, this week we're continuing in Isaiah, but we're going to take a break today to think about, the history of this book and how it came to us. One of the big questions when it comes to Isaiah is this one complete book by one author written at one time, or is it a combination of prophetic words from different times that have been edited together? Now, I think the common assumption is the first, right? And we think that about every biblical book, that it's one author sitting down and doing this all at once, because that's how we write books. But in the ancient world, it wasn't so simple. In fact, many, especially in the Old Testament, the books have a longer process. There are edits and revisions. They didn't have the idea of intellectual property, so it wasn't as strange to come along and adapt things. And so the common consensus is that Isaiah is a composite of different prophets. And so you have Isaiah of Jerusalem in chapters 1 through 39. He was prophesying in the 8th century. You actually see him appear in the book of 2 Kings with King Hezekiah. At that time, the enemy was Assyria, and so that's who he talks about a lot in his book. And in that section, there's a lot of harsh judgment. That's what we heard from last week. And so he's predicting exile if the people don't change. But then you get to chapters 40 to 45, and we have Isaiah of the exile. So this is almost 200 years later in the 6th century. And now the enemy is Babylon, and their hope is in the Persian king Cyrus, who is going to take over and release them from captivity. And so in this section, it's more comforting words of hope. So that's where we're going to be this week. Maybe you're excited after all the judgment last week. And the reason that we think that this is from a later period is that it speaks of the exile as a past event or as a present reality. They're not saying someday you're going to be exiled, but then there's hope you'll get to return. It's now that we're in exile, now it's time to come home. And then some think there's even a third section to the book in chapters 56 to 66 that's a little bit later in the 6th century. And at this point, the people have come back from exile and they're in the land again, but things aren't as great as they hoped. It doesn't seem like everything's fully restored. And so you get a mix of both warnings of, right, don't make the same mistakes, but also hope that God is still working. Okay, why does all this matter? It's an interesting scholarly question. But I think it does matter to us in the sense of what does it mean to be prophetic? And what kind of prophetic voice do we need to hear? If you think being prophetic just means predicting the future, well, then you're going to prefer that other way of reading it. Because, naming King Cyrus before he's even born, it just proves your understanding. But that's, again, reading our assumptions about what prophecy is into the Bible instead of reading the Bible for what it is. Instead, we ask, what word from God do we need to hear right now? It's been said that prophets comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And so that's actually a good way to divide the first two sections, and that the third is a bit of both. Are we in a time of comfort, too much comfort, because we're complicit in injustice that makes our lives easier at the expense of others? Or are we in a time of affliction, suffering from our own choices because of the unjust actions of the powerful? We can turn to the parts of Isaiah that we need to speak in both of those. Today, at least, it's the third section of Isaiah that speaks to me. Because there are ways in which it feels like we're past the worst of it, and yet things still don't feel right. It doesn't feel settled. It's not all that we had hoped for. There's a sense in which we are at home, but we're still in exile. There is still lingering brokenness in our own hearts and in the world around us. And yet, hope remains. God still has not abandoned us, even now.